When I do these talks, I always do it with some heartburn because, I don't ever profess to be an authority on the topics I share necessarily. I know that someone somewhere knows infinitely more than I do about a given topic, and that's certainly the case with Marion Hargrove. He has been interviewed hundreds of times, and his works have been reviewed and studied, and his family roots in this community are very, very deep and wide, and I suspect that some of you may have your own experiences and stories about it, but I'm excited to share with you what I know. For my part, I had never heard of Marion Hargrove until about 26 years ago, because my daughter had just been born, and I was writing for the Mount Olive Tribune, and the late Mildred Andrews Crone, was president of the Friends of Steele Memorial Library, and with some help from a high school friend who happened to be Marion's youngest sister, Cheryl, who lived in Chapel Hill, Mildred finagled a literary gift from Marion Hargrove, a treasure trove of original scripts, letters, books, photos, family histories, and more. It was a decision that Marion at the time said that he didn't actually make. I didn't decide, he said, when I interviewed him for a story in the fall of '97. I didn't decide. Mildred Crone and my sister Cheryl decided, and they told me. But he didn't begrudge the gift in the least. I was tickled and very happy, he said. I didn't have any other plans for my materials. I would rather for them to be back from where I started. So here we are, 26 years later, and I'm delighted to tell you what I know of the story of Marion Hargrove. So, let's see if I can get my directional arrows going. Okay, so the funny thing is, when I mention Marion Hargrove, most people give me a blank look. Because they're not familiar with him. And so how could he be the most famous person to ever hail from Mount Olive, but no one has ever heard of him? But, so here's the short description of Marion Hargrove. Number one, he's a writer, and a good one. He was a World War II draftee, we know that, and the columns he wrote for his newspaper back home while he was stationed at Fort Bragg became a record-breaking, best-selling book and a successful movie with a sequel. And that was all 80 years ago. So he also settled into a writing career in the movie and television business out in Hollywood, where he retired in the 1980s, and he passed away in 2003, and that was 20 years ago. So there is this generational lag between the generations of folks who knew him and knew something about him and where we are today. But that's why we're here, right? We want to share the news about Marion Hargrove and how cool he really was. He could be a little cantankerous, at times a bit profane. He had a dry sense of humor, and he worked hard at his craft, and he was proud of it. And he may have left Mount Olive at the age of 10, as a 10-year-old boy back in 1929, but Mount Olive never left him. All right. So I don't think anybody in here are Jernigans or Hargroves, but do any of you have Jernigans or Hargroves in your family tree? Actually, I think I have a Jernigan in mine. But if you do have a Jernigan or Hargrove in your family somewhere, chances are pretty good then that you're connected to Marion Hargrove. Marion's roots run deep, as I've said. Thomas Jernigan settled in the New World back in 1635, and the local branch of the Jernigans settled in Johnston County in the 1730s. And the Hargroves showed up at about the same time in this area. So Marion's cousin Lillian Jernigan Worley of Clinton, with help from her sister Lucille, published a book of the Jernigan family history, and Marion helped him with the process, and he wrote the foreword. And he clearly enjoyed his family's history and was very proud of it. The family was more to Marion than the lines in the book and the stories. Mount Olive was home, where he was from, where his mother and extended family remained. For all that Marion did and traveled and achieved, he always thought of Mount Olive as home. And he wrote of it, and he talked of it, and he visited when he could. This picture, by the way, is of Lillian Royal's first grade class at Mount Olive Elementary School. It was published in the Tribune. I've got the date on it, but in the history pictures that are, and Bill Lane is in this picture, because that's who provided it to the Tribune, and he offered what identifications he could. Well, Marion is the little 6-year-old boy on the second row there on the end. So in just a short time from this picture, his life is going to take a change. So, this is a big name for a little boy. Edward Thomas Marion Lawton Hargrove, Jr. was born on October 13th, 1919. His father, Marion Sr., was a railway mail clerk, and his mother was Emma Jernigan Hargrove. Marion Jr. was the oldest of 7 Hargrove children: Talmadge, Melba, Rex, Daphne, and Doris, who were all born in Mount Olive, and his baby sister Cheryl, who was born later in Wilson. His father's parents were Kate and Ed Hargrove. You know, when you're talking about folks from Mount Olive, you always have to know who they're kin to and who their parents are and their grandparents. And the same for Marion. So pictured at the left are his maternal grandparents, Lou and Lum Jernigan. And there's a picture of them on the front porch, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Columbus Jernigan. They lived at 401 East Main in Mount Olive at the corner of Jefferson Street, and Marion and his family lived behind them and sort of around the corner on Jefferson. Marion, his grandfather Jernigan was Marion's hero, and his other hero was Dr. John Wilkins. I should note here that Dr. Wilkins delivered Marion, as well as his Uncle James, Wilkins Jernigan, and over the next 5 years, all of Mary's brothers and sisters that were born in Mount Olive. It was the beginning of a lifelong endearment. So, if y'all are familiar with where he lived over on East Main Street, well, he was practically across the street from Myrtle Grove Cemetery. So, in a 1993 letter to Dr. Wilkins' widow, Eva, and you'll hear some more about that in a couple weeks, he wrote a happy birthday letter to Miss Eva Wilkins on her 95th birthday. And Marion describes the day that he, his brother Talmadge, and his Uncle James, who were all born within 17 months of one another, if you can get that wrapped around your head, but they were playing in the cemetery. And it was in the fall of 1927, and Marion was 8 years old. Well, a particular headstone made a really satisfying noise when pushed, and so Marion naturally pushed it again, and when he did, it toppled over on the top of his leg. Well, immediately his brother took off from home, screaming to his mama that Marion had been cut in two, and James ran home to his daddy to tell him, to say that Marion had been killed. So they left Marion there to fend for himself. And Marion, logically reasoning what his mother would do, literally hitched a ride to Dr. Wilkins' office. So Dr. Wilkins puts 30 stitches in his leg above his knee, 30 stitches. He had 2 big gashes across the top of his leg. And he ordered him to bed for the next 2 or 3 months to heal. And here's this little 8-year-old boy saying, what am I going to do in bed for 3 months? And Dr. Wilkins' answer was, And as Marion wrote in the letter, with nothing else to do but to wait for threads to rot and flesh to heal and flesh to grow, he started reading. And in his words, he read every damn thing in the house. And that, he says, set him up for the rest of his life. So Marion's family left Mount Olive when he was 10 years old in early 1929. They went to Florence, South Carolina first, and then to Wilson and up to Raleigh before they landed in Charlotte. So Marion actually finished junior high school and went to high school in Charlotte at Charlotte Central High. And his writing skills showed early promise. He was a features writer and editor for his high school paper, and he worked as a high school correspondent for the Charlotte News. And that's Marion in the middle with three of his pals, his journalism buddies, from high school. That was in 1937. He technically didn't graduate from high school the next year. He refused to take his geometry thing. And so he was a half credit short. I'm thinking, how did you get away with a half credit for geometry? But anyway, he was a half credit short and didn't graduate. But once he became famous later on, he was granted his high school diploma. But the Charlotte News hired him in 1939 after he got out of school and had tried some other things. And they said, well, we'll hire you to write obituaries. Which, you know, that's always the first job you're hired for in newspapers, writing obituaries. Marion said he also served as the window page editor, the hospital editor, the rewrite man, the tourist guide for visiting school children, and in his words, the butt of office jokes. But within about 2 months' time, he was the features editor for the Charlotte News. And then in July of 1941, he was drafted into the U.S. Army. Well, the Charlotte News, not wanting to lose the talents of a young writer, asked Marion to write a column about his experiences as an Army recruit. So from his post at Fort Bragg, he sent back regular dispatches for his column in the Army now. His were the funny stories of a hapless GI. He overslept, he turned left when he should have turned right. He spent a lot of time on weekend KP duty. But later, he marveled at how all of the young men, himself included, were turning into soldiers. And after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he noted that the men around him had a new somber resolve as they went off to war. In February of 1942, playwright Maxwell Anderson visited Fort Bragg. He was working on his play, The Eve of St. Mark, a play about military life. And by then, Marion, amazingly, had been promoted to corporal and was working in Fort Bragg's public affairs office. So he was assigned to show Maxwell Anderson around the base. Well, Marion showed Maxwell his columns. And Maxwell actually was very impressed. And he took them back with him to New York and shared them with a neighbor of his, William Sloan, who happened to be an editor at a publishing company, Henry Holt. So Sloan compiled the columns into a book and suggested the title, See Here, Private Hargrove. And Anderson wrote the foreword. So when you hear about an overnight sensation, well, this was pretty much an overnight sensation. When it was published, it soared to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It stayed #1 for 3 months, and it remained on the list for another 4 months. As you see, it sold over 3 million copies. At the time, Marion was the youngest person ever to have a nonfiction book reach #1 on the Times bestseller list. He was 22. 22. And I want you to see, you see that baby face right there? He's just like a puppy. But that was his picture that was used with a column at the Charlotte News in the Army. You know, Marion's book served as a touchstone for millions, for a generation of military recruits and their families in wartime America. As Marion said in an interview for the Goldsboro News Argus, the book was so perfectly timed and so perfectly fit what people want. Ernest Hamner Jr., who was the creator of the Waltons, he became good friends with Marion in the 70s when the two worked together on the show, but he had read Marion's book himself while he was serving in the Army during the war. In the Los Angeles Times obituary about Marion, Hamner is quoted as saying, "I think every GI read it, and it enabled us to laugh at ourselves. I know some of the experiences were of being young and away from home for the first time in that very strange atmosphere where you really were just a dog soldier. That's what we were called." Hargrove, he said, provided the humor that helped us all see ourselves not just as dog soldiers, but as those young men away from home, homesick, lovesick, and scared. The success of the book, Marion said many times, was unreal and not a little overwhelming. And like I say, that picture of him and how young he was, and literally within a period of months, his life had changed. So we all know what happens with a successful book. They make a movie. MGM Studios released a successful film version of the book in 1944. It starred Robert Walker as Private Hargrove and Donna Reed as his love interest. Now, I will say, Marion married two beautiful women, but the thoughts of this little puppy-looking recruit with this gorgeous Donna Reed. To me, I got to see the movie. I got to see how all that plays out. But Marion did not write the screenplay for this. But I want to show you the trailer. If I can make sure we get that squared away. I think the trailer was fun to give you an idea.
Private Hargrove? Hey, Hargrove, how you coming with the garbage cans?
Please, Hargrove.
Private Hargrove. Hargrove! Hargrove!
Private Hargrove, sir. Private Marion Hargrove, D Battery, 1st Battalion, 1st Regiment, Field Artillery Replacement Training Center, Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Hargrove, I don't mind telling you that when you first joined this battery, my first impulse was to resign and join the Navy.
Yes, sir.
Weren't you late falling out for reveille this morning?
Well,
Weren't your leggings on backwards?
Yes, but...
Yeah, I know. You went back to fix them. When you came back, you didn't have your field hat on.
Yes, sir.
Do you mean to say that you don't know about Hargrove?
We thought you knew.
Well, what happened? Tell me.
Measles. German measles.
Those rats will stop at nothing. Oh, my gosh, my train.
But you've got almost 2 hours left.
I know it. But we haven't even started to say goodbye.
All right, so Mom explaining it started at 6 instead of 6:30. Sorry. I'm glad you're here.
I was 8 and 6.
first one, See Here, Private Hargrove. And by the way, I'll put in a plug for the Mount Olive History Museum because this poster is on display there. But a sequel came out in 1945, What's Next? What Next? Corporal Hargrove, and Robert Walker starred in that one too. And he is adorable in this screen. All right, and meanwhile, and all this is happening, meanwhile, Marion is still in the Army. So in all the time that the book was published, the production and the distribution of the movie, and work started on the sequel, Marion was still in the Army, doing his thing. In early 1942, he was assigned to Yank, which at the time was a new GI weekly publication, and he was transferred to New York. Over the next 3 years, he was sent literally around the world as a correspondent and managing editor of the China, Burma, and India edition. And this picture was taken of him leading cows around in China in 1943. Now, I would love to know the story behind this picture, and I'm confident that it is written down somewhere. I just got to find it. But I just thought that was hilarious. So, and I love this picture as well. In a sign of the times and an illustration of the sacrifice of families all over the United States during those war years, the Mount Olive Tribune reported in September 1944 that Mrs. Marion Hargrove Sr. had 3 sons serving in the military. All 3 of her sons. Rex, on the end, was an aerial gunner in the Air Corps stationed in England. Marion had just returned to New York from China and is his assignment for Yank. And Talmadge, on the end, he was in the infantry stationed at Camp Hood, Texas. Marion was discharged in 1945 at the rank of sergeant. So, what happens next? After his discharge, Marion found work in several magazines and a short stint with Warner Brothers in Hollywood, but he left Warner Brothers to become an editor at Argosy, which was a leading men's magazine at the time. The fame of See Here, Private Hargrove had rattled him a bit. He told the New York newspaper PM in January of 1947 that he was just an ordinary guy writing for a small audience, and suddenly success picked me up and threw me away out there somewhere, and there were 2 or 3 million people with some idea of what to expect from me next. It was a paralyzing feeling. So it took him a while for him to publish again. His next book was a novel, Something's Gotta Give, and that came out in 1945 and 48, and it was a story of a couple working in radio. And he followed that book up with A Girl He Left Behind in 1956. This one was also sort of a war-themed movie. That one, or book, that one made it into a movie starring Natalie Wood and Tab Hunter. And there's Marion, by the way, with Natalie Wood. After Something's Gotta Give, Marion left New York for California, focusing his writing efforts on movies and TV. He wrote an amazing variety of genres: westerns, family dramas, mysteries, intrigue, comedies, musicals. He was a principal writer for the TV Western series Maverick, and he wrote 9 episodes for that one. It was a good fit for Marion's world of characters. James Garner played Brett Maverick, the roguish gambler with a soft spot to do the right thing. Marion wrote 2 of the series' most popular episodes, The Jail at Junction Flats and Gunshot. Well, he was known for his witty stage directions. Actor James Garner gave Marion credit for inserting more comedy into the Maverick episodes by virtue of what he called the beady little eyes bit. That name came from a stage direction that Marion wrote for James Garner's character. Marion looks at him with his beady little eyes. Other examples of his stage directions: he looks as if he's lost his place in the script. Cousin Lonnie is an early Rotarian type with a hearty hand clasp and a big mouth. Suddenly, Lydia looks at her hand as if it were being dipped in cold spaghetti at a Halloween party. But my favorite one, Brett gives him a strong sideways look, knowing very well that Van is about as sentimental as a bank examiner. You know, viewers never see or hear those words in the shows, but the humor of the stage directions certainly spilled over into the actual lines themselves. Marion also wrote 5 episodes of The Waltons, and 2 of those are arguably among the best of the entire show, The Prophecy and The Remembrance. And they were also Marion's personal favorites out of what he did for The Waltons. The Prophecy was the episode where John Walton was worried about his upcoming 25th high school reunion and how to face his highly successful classmates. And I'm sitting here thinking, he had all those kids at his 25th high school reunion? Holy cow. Anyway, in The Remembrance, Grandpa's cousin Zadok visits to settle his affairs. That episode was nominated for the prestigious Humanities Prize, which recognizes writers for probing the meaning of human life in the Waltons. Marion also wrote for shows like I Spy, Fantasy Island, 8 is Enough, you know, these sound familiar, 77 Sunset Strip, The Magician, and literally dozens of others. And yes, that is Bill Cosby, with co-star Robert Cole in I Spy, which in itself was a groundbreaking show of its own that he was a part of. So Marion wrote screenplays for 9 different films. His most successful venture was The Music Man, which he transformed from August Wilson's hit Broadway musical to the big screen. The film starred Robert Preston and Shirley Jones, and you can't see it very well, but right here, the poster gives Marion Hargrove credit as a screenwriter, which is really exciting. I would think it'd be really cool. The Music Man was nominated for 12 awards in 1963, and they won. And the film won 6, including Golden Globe Award for the Best Motion Picture Musical. And Marion himself won an award out of The Music Man. He earned the Best Written American Musical awarded by the Writers Guild of America. So by the time Marion had reached his 60s, and this was in the early 1980s, he realized that he didn't like much of what was on TV. So he retired. He told columnist Roger Miller in 1988 that I decided if I could not watch the crap shown on TV, I couldn't justify writing for it either. And he wasn't referencing sex or morality or violence. He saw a decline in the craftsmanship of the writing. TV, he said, was lacking in any basic entertainment values. It's hastily written, hastily thrown together. And he retired after there was a revival of Brett Maverick, which he was a part of, and that kind of fizzled, and so he retired after that. But I think retirement for him was a little more gradual than that, as he described it to a movie writer, Lawrence Trotman, in 1998. Sometime back, he said, I had a period where I had nothing to do on my word processor. That time went on and on. Later, I had some occasion to use it, and I could not remember anything about how it worked, and I have been happy ever since. So a little bit about his family. Marion had married Allison Pfeiffer of Vermont while still in the Army in 1942. Together they had 3 children, Christopher, Stephen, and Penny. The couple divorced in 1950. Christopher Hargrove, or Kit, as he was known, the oldest son, became the second Private Hargrove in the family. He had enlisted in the Army in 1964. As the New York Times reported, Kit indicated that, unlike his father, he had no difficulty mastering the M15 rifle, the bayonet, or the proper way to salute. And he didn't insult the mess sergeants either. But he did read his father's book 3 times before he enlisted. In 1954, Marion married again, this time to Robin Edwards Roosevelt, and they had 3 children together, Janie, Martha, and Edward. And he also had a stepdaughter, Juliana. So in the picture on the left, that is Jamie and Juliana. They're goofing around. And this picture, which was much later in 96, it's Marion with his daughter-in-law and son, Holly and Stephen Hargrove. So Marion brought his first 3 children to Mount Olive for a visit in 1951 and spent time at his mother's home here in Mount Olive. And the Goldsboro News Argus sent a reporter down to interview him, local celebrity, come home. And living in New York at the time, Marion talked wistfully of moving back to Mount Olive at some point, but of course he never did. But he would come home over the years, visiting with family and friends, catching the Jernigan family reunion when he could, and when he couldn't get home, he tried to keep in touch. So this is a photo, and I wish Don Hargrove were here tonight, but above is a photo of Marion on the end, and his sister Cheryl, who's wearing the sunglasses. And he's visiting with Hargrove cousins down in Botanicus. So the lady standing right beside him is Ruby Hargrove Swenson. On the other side is Ruby's sister Rosabelle, and she was a Sanderson. And then their half-brother, Relma Hargrove. Right? Yes. And of course, we all know Relma. Relma was the physician's assistant in Mount Olive Family Medicine for years. And Don's dad, and so I was telling him about, I found this picture in archives, and he really needed to come tonight so you can see it. But I thought it was kind of cool. So, I mentioned at the beginning of tonight about the work of Friends of the Library, Stillman Library, and Mildred and her connection with Marion's sister. All that got started because we had a brand new library. We had just moved out of the original Still building in 1995 and across the street to the bank building. And so we had a brand new library, although it was small, it was brand new. And the Friends wanted to get a collection of books from local authors for their history collection. And so Marion ran into Cheryl and said, do you think we could get a book, one of Marion's books for the library? And Cheryl says, I think you ought to ask him for the whole collection. So that's pretty much how it went down. Mildred wrote and asked him, and after about 2 weeks later, he called her and said, sure. So I love this picture. It was actually part of an article that I read. I should took that picture. Anyway, Louise Bryant was a librarian at the time, and Mildred. And then standing behind is Frances Williams and Margaret Cicada. And they were sort of the core group that kind of ushered all this process of getting the collection here to Mount Olive. Let's see. They organized a dedication which came in May of 1998. But I want to talk about the collection because it's amazing what all is in there. And I think if I had a couple of days, I've actually been rummaging around in that cabinet all week, kind of getting ready for this talk, and Paige just graciously turned me into the cabinet with the key. But 60 original manuscripts, tons of articles. books written by Hargrove and books from his personal collection that were sort of important to him in his lifetime, scrapbooks and photos, original magazine articles that he wrote, and magazine articles about him. And there are lots of those. It includes over 500 letters to family, particularly among his older children, Penny and Christopher and Stephen. Professional correspondence to agents, publishers, and directors in movies and television. Letters to Hargrove from celebrities, like Gloria Swanson and Harry Truman. Isn't that cool? I didn't actually get to, I saw that on the shelf too late, and I had to leave, but I thought, man, I need to flip through that one. I didn't get to. I saw that one kind of late. I may bug you to come back and look through that one. Plus family history, and there's the book, The Jernigan Family History, that he had written the foreword for, and genealogical records, war service in the Civil War, and all kinds of stuff from his ancestors. So it's quite the collection. So the dedication for this was held in May of '98, and it was a grand affair. The date was actually set to coincide with the Jernigan family reunion the same weekend. Over 150 library supporters and Hargrove relatives from both sides of the country attended. Chairs were set up on the lawn in the front of the library. How many of y'all were there? Who was there? You and me? Nobody else was there? They had the chairs set up all on the front lawn. You would think, we were on the front lawn of the White House, but we had the chairs on outside, and it was May 1998. And I was on maternity leave. I was getting ready to come back. That's how I can remember the dates and know where to go look. But I was getting ready to come back and I had to leave this early. We'd gotten through the dedication part and the comments and stuff, and Michael's on the phone saying, "You got to come home. I can't do anything with this baby." She was 2 months old. So that's how I remember that day. But so I love there were tons of pictures that day. But there's Marion, and he's talking with Brownie Hargrove, a cousin from Kinston, and Ruby Lewis, and they were childhood classmates, and chatting away. Marion's sister and her family were there from Chapel Hill, and attending with Marion were his wife Robin, and 3 of his children, Jamie, Penny, and her son Ben, and Martha and her husband Greg. And Martha talked about how thrilled the family was for their father's works to be all housed in a single place and back in his hometown, which I thought was really cool. So, we do what small towns do. Mayor Ruff Huggins presented Marion with a framed resolution and a key to the town, and Teddy Cox Murray of Wilmington. She was a schoolmate of Marion's at Malibu Elementary. She references her, and he references her in the Miss Eva letter, that Teddy sat 2 seats in front of him in 3rd grade, I think. And that's the way, which I thought was really cute. How do you remember that? I can't remember that. And then it was time for Marion himself to give a few words. And he says, "I left here in the 1930s. And you've always been with me. And I've always been, as my cousin Melba says, as much country as the rest of us." So that was a really neat day, and I'm grateful that I got to be a part of it, even though I had 6 months before I had never heard of Marion Hargrove in my life. So I want to say thanks to Paige and the staff, because she's turned me in and out of the cabinet multiple times this week as we're getting ready for it. And I hope y'all know a little more, can appreciate Marion Hargrove a little more, and talk about it a little more. And one of these days we can have a film festival that will fill the room. Thank you.